This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi everyone, I'm Tanya.
And I'm Talia.
And we are TNT Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Hey Talia.
Hi, Tanya.
How you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing okay in the midst of this global crisis. It's been not very good for my mental health, but
I'm doing okay with it.
Good.
You don't like being around people anyway. Why?
I know.
What's the problem?
I thought I would love this, frankly. I thought I would love the fact that I could just stay home.
And do nothing. And you can do, if I call you up and be like, hey, you want to do something? You can be like, sorry, Talia.
Sorry, I can't go. And I'm struggling.
Wow.
I know, I miss people. Isn't that weird?
That is weird.
So are you ready for the story today?
I'm excited. I need some true crime.
This
I can't
has
watch
been a
it.
nice escape.
Yeah, I can't watch it at home with my kids. My 8-year-old isn't into it.
She's not. That's crazy.
Oh.
I'm going to tell you today about the Truro murders, which happened in Australia. I got most of the information for my story today from a book called The Truro Murders by Ryan Green. So on April 25th, 1978, a man named William was out looking for mushrooms. He was near the city of Truro, which is located in the state of South Australia, which is about 50 miles from the main big city of Adelaide. William often went out to enjoy the outdoors and soak up the sunshine, but where he would go looking for these mushrooms, he had to be careful because there's a lot of rattlesnakes and poisonous spiders. And the land out there is kind of arid and very hot. He didn't have much success that day finding mushrooms, and he was about to call it a day. But
Can you just go to the grocery store?
I know.
It just sounds way easier.
I know. I guess wild mushrooms are better. I don't like mushrooms.
What
so
kind
I have
of mushrooms are these?
Exactly. However, something in the dirt caught his eye. It was a long bone that was poking out of the dirt and the rocks. He thought, what is a cow bone doing out in the middle of nowhere? He didn't do much investigating, though, so he just went on with his mushroom hunting, and he went home. But the idea of the bone out in the middle of the wilderness really just kind of nagged at his brain, and he told his wife about it. And his wife said, well, the next time that we have a day off together, we'll go, and you can show me where the cow bone is. So they do. They get out there in the wilderness. After about a half an hour looking, they find it. His wife's the brave one because she went over to the bone and she yanked it out of the ground. And when she yanked it out of the ground, a shoe popped out with it.
Oh!
Again, still they thought this is a cow bone.
With a shoe?
With a shoe, and they were like, who's pulling a prank by putting a shoe on a cow bone?
Do cows in Australia wear shoes?
Hey, maybe. I'm not from Australia, but maybe. I don't know. But I doubt it.
Oh, should we give a shout out, by the way, to all of our Australian fans? This one's for you.
William took off the shoe from the bone. There were some smaller bones in the shoe, some skin, and some painted toenails.
Oh, I know cows don't paint their toes.
No, and it was at this point they realized this was not a cow and it was a person, and they ran back to their house and they called the police. Police come out, and near where the leg bone was found, they found other bones that had been scattered by the scavengers. It took them a while before they realized there had to have been a body out there.
Do they think it was buried?
No.
So somehow just through time it got stuck in the ground?
Yes. They couldn't determine a cause of death because obviously these are just skeletal remains. So they decided that this must have been a woman who went out hiking for the day, failed to bring proper provisions or got lost, and she just either died from the elements or dehydration or what have you.
Was there a missing woman in that area that matched all of that?
Well, they did figure out who it was, and she had been missing. They figured out who she was through jewelry that was left with the body and dental records. and they find out that she is 18-year-old Veronica Knight. She had been missing for 2 years before her bones were found. She disappeared the day before Christmas Eve after she had gone out to do some last-minute Christmas shopping. And it doesn't quite make sense that here's a girl in Adelaide doing Christmas shopping. Now she's near Truro hiking for the day, which Truro is about 50 miles from Adelaide. And
did she tell people she was going hiking?
No. But it's 1978 and police were like, she must have been out hiking, the end. And they closed her case. They figured she's a teenager. Teenagers make bad decisions. She must have went out hiking.
Usually teenagers make bad decisions such as smoking doobies.
Not going hiking.
Not going hiking without telling anybody by themselves in the desert area.
I know, it just does not make sense. Since these are skeletal remains and they close the case, nothing further happens. But about a year later, after Veronica's body's found, 2 hikers were out enjoying the day about a mile away, and they came across some more skeletal remains of another girl, who police identified as 16-year-old Sylvia Pittman. She had also been missing about 2 years. Like Veronica, animal scavengers had destroyed much of the evidence at the scene. However, there finally was someone on the police force who thought maybe this girl is related to the girl we found a year ago. They also
her death.
Her death. And there had been several girls that had gone missing around the same time that Veronica and Sylvia had gone missing. They disappeared within a short period of time from each other. But since there is very little evidence to go on besides their skeletal remains, the case went cold. Police did offer a money reward for anybody that had information, but they really didn't get any leads right at that time. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and tell you about a man named James Miller.
I feel like I don't like James Miller.
Probably not. James Miller was born in February of 1940. He was the youngest of 6 children to a really poor family who was financially struggling. Due to the family's financial hardship, no one in their family really paid much attention to James. So he ran away from home quite frequently. So the local police knew that he was kind of a troublemaker. By the time he was 11, he was shipped off to a reformatory school. The school was actually kind of run more like a prison than a school. It was only a school for boys, and while he's at the school, James realizes he's gay. When he leaves the reformatory school, and even though it wasn't specified, I think he's probably like 18, he really didn't have much of an education or any job experience, so he ended up finding work as a general laborer. It was really difficult for him to find jobs, so he ended up venturing into the world of crime as a thief. He wasn't a very good thief, though, either, because in the course of his criminal life, which probably spanned about 20 years, he had been convicted 30 times of crimes such as car theft, larceny, breaking, entering, purse snatching, and stealing. And I should note that none of his crimes were violent. They were really more property crimes. He did try to leave the life of crime several times, but he would return to it because he had a difficult time earning any money.
How do you get convicted 30 times and yet you're still out there stealing?
I thought that too.
I go through a stop sign and I'm going to get 6 months in jail.
When he was 34, he was in jail and he got a new cellmate. And his cellmate was named Christopher Worrell. Chris was 20 years old, so he was considerably younger than James. Chris stood out in prison too because he was described as handsome. He had long black hair and a really infectious smile.
Is he cute? I gotta see a picture of him.
He might be cute by 1978 standard or 1970 standards. I really didn't find him all that cute.
He's not my type, but
to each his own.
Yes.
He also seemed to have a very upbeat attitude, which was a contrast from James's constant depressed mood. I think James was depressed just because he was not very attractive and he was gay. I think he was just lonely.
And his life was shit.
James was immediately attracted to Chris, and he was really excited to share the cell with him. But Chris had a darker side. While James was serving time for theft, Chris was in prison due to being accused of committing a violent rape on a woman. And he was out on parole when he did this for armed robbery. It was obvious to inmates that were in the prison with them that James was attracted to Chris, but at first, Chris acted like he didn't see the attraction, but he did encourage James to have a good friendship with him. Chris was really nice to James, and James thought at first that the rape charges had to be wrong. Chris told James that it was all a crazy misunderstanding and that the truth was he had sex with this woman, they had been drinking, and the sex was consensual. He convinced James he was going to beat the charges. But Chris did not beat those charges. In fact, when he was convicted, the judge described him at the sentencing as, quote, a depraved and disgusting human being.
He must have been more than some date rape going on.
Right. The story of consensual sex fell apart, and it was revealed that his victim was a teenage girl who he attacked after picking her up while she was hitchhiking. He was sentenced to a maximum of 4 years in prison, and he also had 2 years added for the armed robbery charge because he had been out on parole when he committed this. I believe that was the rest of the sentence that he had before he got paroled. Soon, Chris and James were transferred to another prison in Yatala, and they no longer shared a cell, but they did spend all of their social time together. And James didn't push Chris into any kind of sexual relationship and seemed to be content on just having a friendship with Chris. They talked all the time, they played cards, it was just strictly friendship. After a few months, James was released, but his freedom didn't last long. He had stolen designer sunglasses and he was trying to sell them in hotel lobbies. And that crime got him sentenced for 18 months.
So he gets to go and hang out with Chris again.
Exactly. When he comes back to the prison, they pick up right where they left off, and the friendship was tighter than ever. However, James was once again released after 9 months, and living on the outside without Chris by this point was really depressing for James. His family was afraid that he was going to reoffend just so he could go back to prison. But 9 months later, Chris was released due to the prison overcrowding.
After he was called depraved by a judge?
Yes.
He got released?
He got released.
What, 2 years later?
Yes. He was reunited once again with James, and they were ready to start their lives together. And this was probably around 1976.
And they're BFFs.
While they were in prison, they had made plans that once they were on the outside, they were going to get an apartment together. But they didn't do that right away when Chris was released because they didn't have any money. So they got jobs, and they were trying to save up for this apartment. They would often go drinking after work, which really kind of defeated the purpose of trying to save money, but it didn't stop them from doing it.
They wanted to have some fun.
While they would be out drinking, James would watch Chris pick up women and take them home and leave him all alone. The jobs they had gotten when they were released from prison, Chris soon lost his job, but James helped him get a job at his place of employment, which, from what I understand, was described as a roadwork gang, so maybe repairing roads. James was really excited because now he got to spend all day with Chris again. At this point, James knew he was in love with Chris, despite Chris never reciprocating these feelings. I'll tell you, after reading a lot about this case, I'm not even sure if Chris's friendship towards James was even genuine. During their days off, Chris would have James accompany him to sex shops in Adelaide.
What is a sex shop?
Like a porno shop where they had magazines and stuff like that.
Gotcha.
James hated to do this, but he went along because he got to spend time with Chris. He was uncomfortable going into these sex shops because Chris's taste in pornography centered around rope bondage, sadism, domination, and rape fantasies.
BDSM.
Chris knew that these visits to these shops made James uncomfortable, but he didn't seem to care.
Well, James didn't have to go.
I know, right?
I mean, I'm just pointing out it's free will.
I think that Chris kind of enjoyed, too, the humiliation that James felt when they went to these shops, so it kind of just, Chris got off on it. Soon their relationship ended up taking a sexual turn. You knew this was going to happen, right?
I was just going to ask, how straight
is Chris? Not 100% straight.
He swings his bat both ways.
Kind of. After visiting one of these sex shops one day, Chris allowed James to watch him as he masturbated while he looked through the magazines.
Oh, I will allow you
to
watch me masturbate, because that's what a good friend I am.
You know.
And I'm going to guess at some point he's going to allow him to suck his dick.
How'd you know?
Well, what a good friend.
That was next.
I knew it. Because that's what friends are for. You can get me off.
You can get me off. And James was happy to oblige.
Oh, that's so sad.
It's very sad because there was never any reciprocation. James was the perfect submissive to Chris's dominant
He's
personality.
looking for love in all the wrong places.
He really is. But soon, Chris decided he wasn't going to let James blow him anymore.
Is there a reason why he no longer is allowing his friend to suck his dick?
James did ask him why, and Chris just told him that, I'm only attracted to women, and if you didn't like it, then it's too bad.
If you didn't like what? The answer?
The answer.
I'd be like, well, why you let me suck your dick before?
I know! Why was it okay yesterday, but not okay today? He told James he just wanted their relationship to go back to how it was, and it was like brothers.
The non-dick sucking days.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
But once you open that can of worms, you can't go back to holding hands.
I know,
Isn't
right?
that what they say?
Yes. Exactly.
Once you suck your friend's dick, you can't just be BFFs again.
It's true, though. You're absolutely right.
You can't put it back in the can.
Can't put it back in the can. So they settled back into their old routine of going out to the bars and Chris picking up women. James thought that maybe Chris would come around again at some point. They were still trying to get this money together to have an apartment.
Where are they living right now?
James is living with his sister, and Chris has an apartment, but it's just by himself.
And is James ever picking up women?
No, James is gay.
Okay, well, and
James is gay.
And Chris is straight, so forgive me for being confused.
From what I understand, James was 100% gay.
Okay.
Because they were having such a slow time saving up money, they decided they were going to start committing crimes in order to get money. Knowing that James was gay, Chris would accompany James to gay bars in Adelaide, where they would work together to pick up usually older, wealthier men and take them back to Chris's apartment. Then they would rob the men and threaten to expose them if they reported it to police, so they were shaking down these poor men. Chris and James became so well known and good at these thefts that they were banned from all of the gay clubs in the city. Finally, now they have their money saved. But instead of getting an apartment, Chris convinces James that they need to buy a car. So they end up buying a white 1969 Valiant sedan. And now Chris had something that he could cruise around in picking up girls. James would act as chauffeur and chaperone for Chris, like his wingman. Being obviously gay, which is how he was described, he was able to help women feel comfortable getting into the car with Chris. And what they would do was, after Chris was successful at picking up a girl, James would drive to a secluded location, park the car. He would then go off and take a walk and have a smoke, and Chris and the girl would have sex. James would come back, everybody was presentable again, and he would drive back into the town, drop the woman off wherever she wanted. And this happened quite a bit.
Were they prostitutes?
No, they were just girls out on the street,
Looking for some fun.
Looking for some fun.
In the woods with a strange man.
And Chris is cute, supposedly. Having a car not only increased Chris's chances to get laid, it also helped he and James to continue to shake down the gay men, because now they would pick them up outside of the gay bars. They continued for several months doing this until Chris grew bored with it, and then they stopped picking up the gay men and robbing them. When they first got the car, James and Chris would pick up girls once or twice a month. Then it increased to every week, and then it was every day. Chris's sexual appetite grew more and more intense, and the frequency failed to satisfy it.
I'm just confused that he can get laid like
that. He's young. He's, like I said, he's like in his early 20s. Apparently cute. It's the 70s. I don't know what's going on.
I don't know either.
But he was quite successful at it. During one of these evenings, one woman decided that Chris's advances were not what she was looking for the night. And instead,
thank you. That's what I'm saying. Someone had to be like, no.
And instead of letting her go, Chris ended up raping her. James was able to convince her not to press charges against Chris, and instead convinced her that she was to blame because, after all, you're the one that got in the car, and you knew what it was all about. After dropping her off, Chris's mood grew very dark, and he demanded that James just leave him alone. So he dropped him off at his house, and James went home. The next morning, Chris arrived to work with James on the road working, and he apologized to James, joking and saying he hoped that evening's hunting trip for quote-unquote rags, that's what he called women, would go much smoother.
Hunting rags.
Hunting for rags. They settled back into their usual routine, which resumed 2 days before Christmas, 1976. Chris got James to go out that night under the guise of we're going to go do some Christmas shopping. And James was really happy to accompany Chris as they strolled through the shops in Adelaide. After a couple hours, they got separated, so James went looking for Chris and found him talking to 18-year-old Veronica Knight. As I mentioned before, she was out doing some last-minute shopping, but Chris was able to convince her to come with them and go on a drive in the foothills of Adelaide. When Veronica got into the car, Chris told James they had to get Veronica back to town and home in time to make her curfew. When he told James this, Veronica looked for reassurance in the rearview mirror. James told her, "I'm sure we'll get you back in plenty of time." Hearing this from James, Veronica relaxed in the back seat. She made chit-chat with them, telling she had been shopping with a friend, but they'd gotten separated. James drove to a secluded spot, and Chris and Veronica were already making out before he was able to excuse himself from the car.
He's a chick magnet.
A chick magnet. James went for a long walk so as to give Chris plenty of time. When he came back to the car, Chris was sitting in the front seat, staring out the front windshield with a blank look on his face. The windows were down, but there was no music, and the night was really quiet. And when James got to the car, he didn't see Veronica. He asked Chris, "Where's Veronica?" Chris didn't answer, and James could tell that Chris was in one of these black moods that he had. After a few moments, he said that Veronica was in the back on the floor of the car. James peeked in the back, saw her pale skin with red welts because Chris liked to use ropes to tie up women.
So wait, that's a new twist. You failed to mention that during his conquests, he was tying these women with ropes?
Tying their hands in their, usually their hands.
So a lot of these women, I'm guessing, weren't consensual. Maybe they hopped in the car consensually, but I can't imagine being okay with a stranger tying you up.
As James describes it, the women that he was just picking up and having sex with, like before the rape started, there seemed to be no problems. So I don't know when along the time he introduced the ropes. I don't know if it was when he started raping women or if he did it when he started killing women. But ropes got introduced, and poor Veronica had welts on her skin. When James asked what happened, Chris just said, "I killed her." James kind of freaked out at this point, and he grabbed the front of Chris's shirt through the window, and Chris grabbed his wrist to break free, and he pushed James away from him, and he got out of the car. James yelled, "Why? What did you do it for? Why?" Chris pulled a knife on James at this point and said, "I'll kill you too. Do you hear me? If you don't lay off, I will kill you too." James was frantic, trying to make sense of everything. He was shaking, and they got back into the car. James started the engine, and at this point now everyone's calmed down. And Chris said, barely audible, "Don't ask me why I killed her. I don't know myself." James looked in his eyes, searching for some kind of remorse, and didn't find any. Chris told James to drive, and he drove out past Truro, about 50 miles, like I said, from Adelaide. They reached a spot with a lot of trees, and Chris told them to stop. They dragged Veronica's body out of the car and into the woods. They didn't have a shovel, so they ended up just covering Veronica's body with branches and shrubbery, and then drove away. And if you remember, her body was the first one that was found.
Yes, it's the cow bone with a shoe.
From the mushroom hunter. During their drive back to town, James couldn't stop shaking, and he was afraid of Chris for the first time in their relationship.
Hell yeah.
Right?
You pull out a knife on me, Tanya.
I killed a girl?
I'm going to be a little bit nervous around you.
Chris noticed that James was upset, and he said, "Was this the first time you've ever seen anyone dead?" Because he told James he's seen plenty. He told James a story from his childhood when he was about 10. He watched a friend drown right in front of his eyes and didn't help him.
What?
What a psycho.
Wow. Give me a second, because that is so bad if you just really imagine how cold and inhumane that is. To not help.
To not help, and you're 10.
Wow.
This story did not make James feel better.
Oh, God, no.
It terrified him.
Yeah, because that just shows that James has no value to Chris.
Right.
He's disposable. God damn.
I know.
The poor drowning kid.
I wish I knew more about the story, because I would wonder, were there any adults around? Where were they swimming? How far away was he?
What happened to little baby Chris?
I know.
That turned him into this.
Chris shared another story
Oh, God.
from when he was in the Air Force.
He was in the Air Force?
He was in the Air Force, apparently before he was 20 and all these crimes started. He had picked up a hitchhiker while he was on leave. He was traveling from Perth to Adelaide. He described her as a cute little thing and told James he stabbed her to death. He said he would never do that again, though, because it was incredibly messy and it took him days to get his car clean. That's why you're not going to do it again. He also told James she wasn't the first hitchhiker he killed.
Oh, he's already a serial killer.
Exactly, right? James is like, what the hell?
I thought I knew you, man.
He said while he was in the Air Force, he killed, quote, plenty of girls. The next thing he told James gave him the chills, though. He said, so you know that I'll have no problem doing you if you say a single word about this to anyone. I don't want to speak about tonight. Not now. Not ever. Do you understand me?
I do, absolutely, 100%.
James nodded. Yep.
Zipping my mouth shut. Throw away the key.
Mum's the word. James then took Chris home. As you know, this happened right before Christmas. So after the holiday, James saw Chris again at work. And Chris was acting as if nothing had happened, which really amazed James because he was really bothered by it over the Christmas holiday. James was struggling to reconcile the charming, happy-go-lucky Chris that he knew and loved with the dark side of his personality. He realized that it didn't matter, though, to him, and he loved Chris.
Oh, God, stop talking.
Oh, this whole story just kind of made me sick. They went out drinking after work, and Chris seemed to notice that there was some tension between them. So to ease the atmosphere, he started showering James with attention, making James feel like he was the center of the world. Yes, he's special, and he was all that mattered to Chris. That night when they were out drinking, Chris had a big announcement. He said, we finally have enough money to get that apartment, and that he found one. James was living with his sister, her husband, and children, so it was quite crowded in the apartment that they lived in, so he was excited to move out. About a week after Veronica was killed, James told his sister he was moving, and she moved out. She got a bigger place, like with her family, and their lease was up like in another week, so James wasn't in a rush to move out. So he kind of, slowly did it over that week. But on January 2nd, James and Chris went out for a night of celebrating and drinking, that they were celebrating the fact that they were moving in together. They drove into the central business district of Adelaide, and at some point, Chris told James to pull over. Chris walked off, and James was left to stay with the car. James was waiting like a loyal pet, and soon afterward, Chris came back to the car with 15-year-old Tanya Kenny. She had just arrived in Adelaide after hitchhiking from Victor Harbor, which is about 50 miles south of Adelaide. They drove to James's sister's apartment, which is now empty besides James, and Chris and Tanya went inside of the apartment while James waited in the car. This was in the morning or early afternoon, so James dozed off, and he was awakened by Chris saying, I need help. But before I tell you what he needed help with, Talia, you know what time it is.
Oh, you are so shameful.
It's time for a shameless plug.
Oh, let's do it. Hey everyone, if you go to our website, tntcrimes.com, you can find full unreleased episodes available for individual purchase. You can also join our membership where you get unlimited access to all of our unreleased episodes and early releases, mini episodes, and so many other awesome things. So go to tntcrimes.com, and thanks again for all your support.
Back. Are you ready to find out what Chris needed help with?
Absolutely.
James recognized the look on Chris's face and knew that he was in one of these dark moods, so he ran into the apartment to see what had happened. On the floor in one of the bedrooms, James saw Tanya's body fully clothed. Her hands and feet had been bound with plastic wire, and she had a large bandage over her mouth. The bandage had already started to be soaked with blood, which was running down her cheek onto the carpet. James exploded and he cussed Chris out, screaming at him, which he said was probably for about 10 minutes. James asked why again, and Chris just shrugged.
What does James expect now? That Chris is not going to be a serial killer?
I don't think James was thinking about any of this.
I know what James was thinking about. It starts with a D and ends with an ick. That's so bad.
You are bad. Because it was daytime, they couldn't move Tanya's body out of the apartment. Chris said they're going to have to just wait to move her that night. But James said they have to move her now. She can't stay on the floor in this bedroom because his sister could come back or the landlord could come in. So they ended up stuffing Tanya's body in a closet, propping it shut with a chair. After they left the apartment, they drove out to the northern outskirts of Adelaide and they dug a shallow grave. As they were digging, Chris's mood improved. Lucky James, right? And he tried joking around with James. James was having none of it. All he could think about was, when am I going to end up in a grave like this? He did notice, though, that Chris wasn't threatening him this time. He realized it was because he had helped Chris cover up Veronica's murder, and he was going to help him cover up Tanya's murder, too. That night, they took Tanya's body from the apartment and drove out to the grave they had dug. James refused to help Chris bury her, though, so he waited in the car until Chris was done. Then the happy couple drove home and spent their first night in their apartment together. After Tanya's murder that January, James and Chris fell into the old routine where they would cruise around, Chris would pick up girls and have sex with them. He wouldn't hurt them or kill them or rape them, and James was almost convinced that Chris wouldn't do it again.
Why doesn't Chris just drive himself?
I don't know. I think he got off on James knowing or James being uncomfortable or putting James through this. This was January 21st, 1977, and while they were out cruising, Chris saw a girl standing at a bus stop. Her name was Juliet Makita, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. She was 16, and she went by Julie. She was waiting at the bus stop to go home after working the night shift. Chris offered her a ride home, and she accepted, getting in the back seat. Chris was in the front seat, and he kept his rope in the glove box. So he gets the rope out of the glove box, and he turns around and he shows it to Julie, and he asks for her wrists. Julie was kind of naive and seemed not to understand anything about bondage, and she also seemed to not understand that Chris had picked her up for sex. This really frustrated Chris, so he tried a more traditional seduction ploy. And despite Julie's nervousness, it seemed to work, so James parked the car and walked away to go buy a pack of cigarettes down the road. He hadn't gone too far when he heard a scream. He ran back to the car to see Julie and Chris wrestling around in the dirt outside of the car. Chris was straddling Julie, sitting on her stomach, and he was strangling her. Her screams were quieted as Chris's grip grew tighter. James was watching this, and he ran over to Chris and tried grabbing him by the shirt, and he was screaming at him that you need to get off of her. But James wasn't strong enough to pull Chris off of her, and Chris continued to strangle her. He also hissed through his teeth that James needed to take his hands off of him or he would be next. And James saw pure hatred in Chris's eyes. This was the first time now James has seen Chris actually kill someone. I mean, he knew he was a killer, but seeing him in the middle of killing Julie was really disturbing. But again, he really didn't care because he was in love with him. And he continued to lie to himself. He was convinced that Chris had like a brain tumor or something that caused these dark moods and would ask Chris to go to the doctor to get checked out, but Chris never did. Julie's body stopped moving, and once Chris confirmed that she was dead, he focused all of his fury on James for quote-unquote spoiling it. As they loaded Julie's body into the back seat, he just continued to scream at James. They covered her with a blanket, and only when she was covered did Chris finally stop screaming at James. James didn't say anything and realized that no matter what he said, Chris was going to continue killing, and he had no power to stop it. They drove out to Truro, but didn't have a shovel, so they took Julie's body out and covered her with the brush and the branches, much like they had done with Veronica. The relationship changed a little after this, and James and Chris didn't go out looking for rags, as they had done. They did continue to go out drinking at night, but Chris didn't pick up any girls. Chris was cold toward James, which broke James's heart.
You know, James can fuck right off, too.
I agree with you. But Chris put such a mindfuck on James that James started to feel guilty for interrupting Chris's killing of Julie. He rationalized that Chris had accepted James for who he was, being a gay guy. And James should do the same for Chris.
So pathetic.
Asking him to change would be selfish. During one of these nights out drinking, Chris told James that he now was ready to settle down, get a steady girlfriend, and would joke with the guys at work saying, oh, if you have a sister or a daughter or someone you want to fix me up with. This sent James into a tailspin because Chris would leave him if he got a steady woman. And the idea of Chris leaving was heavy on his mind. On February 6, 1977, when on the drive home, they were going past the train station, and Chris told James to pull over and said, I want that one. The woman he was talking about was 16-year-old Sylvia Pittman. Chris turned on the charm, and soon Sylvia was in the back seat. Sylvia told James where she was headed, and he drove off. She never noticed the direction they were headed because she was really chatty. They drove out of town, and soon James parked the car. He left to go on one of his walks, and when he returned, he saw Chris outside of the car smoking a cigarette. James could tell from Chris's face that Sylvia was dead. When James got close enough to Chris, he smacked James across the face and told him, if you say one word tonight, I swear to you, I will dump your worthless corpse out in the desert just like that rag. One word and you're done for. I'm not going to ask twice. James nodded and got in the car. He saw Sylvia's body under a rug in the back seat, and she was fully dressed and she wasn't bound. But he did notice that the pantyhose she had been wearing earlier were tightly wrapped around her throat. James said her complexion was purple and her eyes looked like they'd been stung with bees. He said her lips were pouted out and her tongue was sticking out. James was taken aback because none of the girls had ever looked like this before, and he couldn't even recognize Sylvia. They drove out to Truro and they dumped her body, covering her again with brushes and sticks. They didn't dig a grave for her. They went home. Sylvia, if you remember, was the second set of remains that was found, the year after Veronica's was found. The next day, Chris's attitude toward James was frosty again. James was feeling guilty and decided, hey, if I find a girl for Chris, then maybe he would get back in Chris's good graces. James went out looking for girls, and while he was doing this, he spotted Chris, who was already chatting up 26-year-old Vicky Howell. James was taken aback a little when he realized Vicky was much older than the teenagers that Chris preferred. But they got into the car, and James drove to a secluded spot and sauntered off. He returned a few minutes later to see Chris sitting up, and Vicky was laying down in the back seat. He saw that Chris had unbuttoned his shirt, and he could see Chris's chest. Chris looked up and caught James's eye and winked at him, and then dipped down to pay more attention to Vicky. James took this as an invitation to stay and watch, so he got closer. Vicky was still wearing much of her clothing because now he can see in the window, and her eyes were closed. James watched Chris wrap a rope around her wrists, and Vicky seemed not to notice. He was smiling as he did this, and James continued to watch. He isn't sure how long he was there, but Chris looked up at him again and laughed. Vicky again didn't seem to care or notice. Chris crept over toward the window and rolled it down and said, as he was still laughing, throwing a pack of cigarettes at James, "Get out of here, you old peeping Tom." James picked up the cigarettes and started to leave, but turned back to get one last look. He saw Chris looking at him, and Chris was licking his lips.
Gross.
James ate up every second and didn't care if Chris was doing it to tease him on purpose. These images just burned into his memory, and he cherished them. He was hoping that maybe Chris would let him watch more one day.
Oh, I'm sure that would be great.
Hey, let's just make it a group activity. James returned to the car and found Chris outside the car smoking with a scowl on his face. James smiled at him, but Chris seemed to just look through him.
Is he in one of his dark moods?
He's in one of his dark moods.
Seems like he gets in a dark mood after the murders. Would you think he would be in a happy mood after the murder? Because he just murdered someone. Whoa, party time.
I guess not. James went to say something to Chris, and Chris again started yelling at him. He insulted James's intelligence, belittled him in his sexuality, his appearance, everything he could think of. He was just screaming at James. Chris was hoping that James would just cower, but it didn't happen. Finally, Chris stopped, and James said, "It's all right. Don't worry about it. It's fine." Chris stared at him incredulously and said, "She's in the back seat under the blanket. I killed her. You get that, right?" James smiled and said, "So we need to get rid of the body, right?" Just like before. "It's no problem, man." Chris's anger toward him seemed to dissipate immediately, and they got into the car. Chris mumbled, "She seemed like such a nice lady."
This is so twisted.
It's so stupid. And James replied, "Oh well, plenty more fish in the sea."
James has come a long way.
He has. He's really come out of his shell. They drove out to Truro to dump Vicky's body like the others. 2 short days later, on February 9th, Chris saw 2 girls leaving a movie when James pulled the car beside them. Chris turned on the charm and said, "What movie did you just see?" They told him, and he said, "Me and Jim were just talking about going to see that one next week. Was it any good?" James was like, "Oh great, we're going to have to improvise." So he starts searching the movie posters, trying to come up with something to say. And he sees the leading man in the poster, and he says to Connie Iordanides, she's also called Connie Jordan, so I'm not sure why she has 2 different names. She was 16. And he says to her with a wink, "He's a real dreamboat, isn't he?" Referring to the guy in the poster. This gave the impression to Connie that James and Chris were gay. The car behind them honked, and Chris thanked them for the recommendation and offered the girls a lift home. Connie accepted, but her friend didn't, despite being very hesitant. There were stories in the news by now of girls disappearing in Adelaide. James asked her for her address, and she gave it. Chris tried to talk to her, but she was really jumpy, looking out the window to see the direction they were headed. She started to really freak out when she saw they were headed in the opposite direction of home. She started to scream. Chris put his hands over her mouth, and there was a mighty struggle between them, all while James was driving. Once James was able to park, he didn't leave the car right away. He watched Chris in the rearview mirror, and Chris was toying with Connie at this part. And I say that because remember the death game that Happy Face Killer did in episode 13? Chris was doing that with Connie. He would strangle her until she passed out. Then when she would wake up, he would do it again. After doing this several times, all while James is watching, Chris unzips his pants. When he heard the reaction from James, Chris noticed him and growled, "Isn't it time for your walk?" James replied, "I'm fine where I am." Chris, with his hands around Connie's neck, said, "Get out of the car now." James pleaded with Chris, "I can stay. I can watch. It's all right. You don't have to hide anything from me, Chris." Chris told him once more to get out of the bloody car and to not forget his bloody cigarettes. James left and came back after a few minutes to find Chris smoking a cigarette outside the car. This, I guess, is his afterglow. After a moment, Chris said, "You did all right tonight, you know that?"
Oh, accolades.
He got praise. And after a moment, he said again, "Not bad, but not great. Don't make it weird again." James said, "I'll do better next time, I promise." Chris told him, "You're making it weird again." And he said, "Just do what I need you to do and don't get so involved. It's not about you." James said he understood. They drove out to Truro, dumped Connie's body like the others. The following day, which was February 10th, James was introduced to Chris's new girlfriend, Amelia.
Lucky girl.
The 3 of them spent the evening at a local bar, drinking and talking. James realized he really liked Amelia and thought she was someone he could be friends with. He did struggle over what the future would look like with Chris and Amelia being a couple. He thought, "I'm definitely going to be the third wheel, and I'm probably going to be like the weird uncle you invite over for holidays," because he had nowhere else to go. He wondered also if he and Chris would continue to go out cruising for rags ever again.
So many questions.
I know, but he didn't have to wait long to get these questions answered, Talia. Because 2 days after Connie was murdered, Chris went on the hunt again. Deborah Lamb was 20, and she actually found them. She was hitchhiking and needed a ride to Port Gawler, which is about 25 miles from Adelaide. Chris always liked to pick up hitchhikers because he felt like they were presents tied with a little bow. He didn't have to do anything to persuade them to get in the car. Deborah hopped in the car and James drove them to a nearby beach. James made a very loud declaration that he was going for a walk, and he could hear Deborah and Chris giggling in the back seat as he left the car. He took his time on the walk, not wanting to upset Chris. When he returned, he saw Chris pushing sand into a hole on the beach where he had just buried Deborah. Little did James know, but Deborah was buried alive, and she was probably suffocating to death as he watched.
Oh, that is so awful.
Isn't it?
I'm assuming the autopsy must have came back showing that she was alive.
Yes, it did.
But he thought she was dead?
I don't know. And I don't know if you've been paying attention, Talia, but this is the 4th girl he killed in a week.
Oh, I did not notice that. What happens when that gets old? Like you order your favorite pizza on a Monday and it's delicious. Tuesday, it's still good. Wednesday, it's like, I don't know. You know what I mean? By Thursday, you're like, no more pizza. You need something else. You need tacos. What do you do?
I don't know. What do you do if you're a serial killer?
You gotta make it more torturous? Do more?
During the next week, James and Chris didn't go out searching for girls, but just did normal things like they went out drinking and visiting friends. During one of the visits, they encountered a woman named Deborah Scuss, who I'm going to call Debbie so as not to confuse her with Deborah Lamb. She was sitting on the floor in an empty apartment of a friend of James and Chris's from jail. She was the guy's girlfriend, and he had moved out while she was at work, taking all of their belongings. She was crying, and James comforted her. As Chris grew impatient, he had zero empathy for her. Chris said, I have a great idea. Let's go for the weekend to Mount Gambier and spend it making happier memories. We'll have drinks and plenty of laughs. So they left that Friday. James had to remind Chris that there's a lot of people that know Debbie's coming with us. So he was really bummed out. And by the next day, they were all having a shitty time, and they decided to go home.
He basically had to remind him, you can't kill this one.
Can't kill this one. They headed home on Saturday, February 19th, 1977, and Chris wanted to drive. He told Debbie to stay in the front seat and hold his beer, because he was drinking heavily.
I love the 70s.
James was in the back seat. Chris was driving like a maniac, going well over the speed limit, all while Debbie's pleading with him to slow down, and Chris is drinking his beer and screaming at her to shut up. It was chaos in the car. Then they blew a tire. James doesn't remember anything after that, but according to police reports, after blowing the tire, Chris tried to get control of the vehicle, but it fishtailed due to the high speed in which they were traveling. Chris slammed on the brakes and the car went out of control and went into the lane of oncoming traffic. A large truck was heading right for them, so in order to avoid a head-on collision, Chris jerked the car onto the side of the road and it flipped, rolling twice down an embankment and throwing its passengers everywhere. An ambulance was called, but it was only going to be needed for James, who suffered a broken shoulder because Chris and Debbie were dead at the scene.
I don't know how I feel. The consequences don't match
the crime.
I'm glad he's dead.
I'm glad he's dead, too.
And poor Debbie.
Poor Debbie. She was an innocent victim in all of this. They do count her as one of his victims, though. After Chris's death, James fell into a deep depression. He needed to attend Chris's funeral, so he ended up signing himself out of the hospital in order to attend it. Chris and James's co-workers had pitched in and put on a little buffet after the funeral. And at that wake, James ran into Amelia. In a conversation with her, James told her he believed that Chris must have had a brain clot on his brain, which must have caused the dark moods. He said he wasn't right. Amelia didn't understand what James was talking about because Chris had been careful to hide the darker side of his personality from her. But James continued. He told Amelia that maybe the accident was for the best.
That is something really weird to say at a funeral.
I know.
Amelia, like, excuse me?
Amelia was like, what the hell are you talking about? And he told her that Chris had to die because he would have never stopped. She wouldn't have been able to stop him, and neither would the police. Amelia was still confused. James was sobbing and nearly incoherent. She comforted him and asked him gently, what did Chris do? James then confesses it all to her. He told her how Chris had killed 7 girls in total. He
knows specifics about.
Yes, that he knows about.
Though the number's much higher.
I'm sure it's much higher. He told Amelia about how he did nothing to stop him. She was shocked, and she was extremely angry that James would say these things about Chris. To her, he was a wonderful boyfriend. I'm going to jump ahead 2 years. The missing girls cases had grown cold from the girls that Chris had picked up. However, in May of 1979, which is a month after they had found Sylvia's body, a woman who said her name was Angela told the police she knew of a man who could help with the investigation on the missing girls. It was later discovered that the caller was really Amelia, and she had been enticed by a $30,000 reward that was being offered.
She never bothered to tell them until that reward was offered?
Yes, which I thought was a real shitbag thing to do.
Of course, look who her boyfriend was, so, I mean, are we surprised?
She told the police how James had confessed to her about the murders at Chris's wake and that they needed to talk to James. On May 23, 1979, James was taken in for questioning. There was no direct evidence linking him to the killing, so the police knew they either had to get a confession from him or maybe he could reveal the location of the bodies that hadn't been discovered. After 6 hours of being interviewed, and after the police told James everything that Angela/Amelia had told them, he decided the jig was up. I'm sure he was just tired and he gave up. He told them everything.
He could have just kept his mouth shut.
He could have. And I don't know why he didn't. I think he just had a miserable life. And probably going to prison wasn't so bad for him. He told the police about how Chris would rape girls and that it eventually escalated to murder. He said he never knew when Chris would murder someone because Chris didn't always kill the girls he picked up. Initially, though, police did not believe James that he didn't play a role in the murders and thought he probably helped force the girls into the car and then hold them down as Chris raped and murdered them.
Well, I believe what he did does qualify as playing a role in the murders.
I do too. James was eventually charged with 7 counts of murder and was found guilty of 6 counts. The jury decided he wasn't guilty of Veronica's murder because he didn't know what Chris was going to do. He was sentenced to 6 life sentences. He was eligible for parole in 2014, but he died from cancer in prison in 2008 at the age of 68. That's my story, Talia. About the horrible serial killer Christopher Worrell.
Thank you, Tanya. As you say to me, well, thank you, Tanya, for sharing today.
Thanks for listening, Talia.
I'm going to drive home and I'm going to think about this case. Because there's a lot of psychological stuff that happens here. There's some dynamics between these two.
I wonder if that's the real story, though. This whole story was based, like I said, off of Ryan Green's book, which was based off of pretty much James's
you're right.
recollection of what happened.
And people always minimize their own roles and things.
Exactly. So I don't know what to believe.
Well, I want to thank you, Tanya, for that excellent episode.
Thanks, Talia. And before we end our episode, we have some shout-outs.
Absolutely we do. And our shout-outs are big thank yous.
Yes.
From our heart.
From deep in our heart.
Beating heart.
We have a shout-out to Gary.
Gary.
We have a shout-out for Terry.
Terry and Gary.
Terry and Gary.
Not a couple that we know of.
That we know of.
They could be hooking up. I don't know.
I don't know
Terry and Gary, but I love them.
We have Jackie.
Jackie.
Libby.
Lisa. Kate.
And last but not least, we have Neela. Thank you, everyone.
Seriously, thank you guys so much.
We love you guys, and we're so happy that you listen, and you loved us so much that you became our members.
For all of you out there that are listening, there's a whole side to TNT Crimes and Consequences that you don't get by just listening to our public episodes. We have online-only episodes that you can purchase on our website, and people have. Thank you, people.
Yes, thank you to everyone who's purchased episodes.
And we also have our members-only section that has episodes and bonus material for released episodes. So we have bonus episodes and episode bonuses available. And you can join by either going to our website, and there's a members section, or you can go to patreon.com/TNT Crimes. Tanya and I do not have any advertising. We don't have advertising because we are supported by you guys. So by becoming a member, you help support us so we can continue to do this. And the more you support us, the less we have to work at our other jobs, and the more we can make these. See, so it's a cycle. And also, if you feel like it, you can buy us a beer or a martini or wine on our website. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
TNTcrimes.com. Thank you, Tanya, for this amazing serial killer episode in Australia.
Until next week, America. Keep your feet on the ground. And keep reaching for the stars.
And stay 6 feet apart.
And stay 6 feet apart.
Thank you, Tanya.
Bye.
Bye.